Hello everyone and welcome to the ACNS ECR webinar about scouting the Australian research environment. As we are gathering online from across Australia and our speakers and much of our audience are streaming in from around Australia, we want to first acknowledge all traditional custodians of country, the first innovators and scientists of this land. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past and present and recognise their continuing relationship with the land, waters and culture. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Christine and I'm joined by Julia, who will be co-chairing the webinar today. So in this webinar, we'll hear from 4 researchers whose work bridges disciplines. They'll share their expertise and discuss the challenges and benefits of interdisciplinary collaborations. Each of the 4 presenters will give a 15-minute talk on these topics, followed by a combined Q&A time for all presenters at the end. So now to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Maggie Evans-Galea is an accomplished STEM executive, board chair and director. She is actively engaged across multiple professional sectors in the broader STEM ecosystem and is an advocate for STEM research, innovation, education, and the development of a highly skilled and diverse future STEM workforce. Maggie has been recognised with an Australian Leadership Award and the Vice-Chancellor's Alumni Excellence Award from the University of Queensland and is also a member of the Order of Australia. So thank you, Maggie Evans-Galea.
Outstanding. Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Julia and Ruben, for the invitation to participate today. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I connect today with you, and that is the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. It is a beautiful day on Wurundjeri country today, and it's always fun to see the sun in Melbourne. So I wanted to preface this by 2 things. One, I've had a dreadful cold, so I apologise if I mute for a bit and take a sip of water or a coughing fit. I'm confident the other panellists will have plenty to say as well, so let's stick with that. But also, I just wanted to say that this is a fairly high-level introduction and that then we can deep dive into that through the panel discussion. So I've really aimed to try and keep it quite high level at the beginning. So I just want to double check everyone can see my screen. I will assume that's a good thing. Excellent. So I'll look over here just because that's where it is on my screen, but please know that I know you're there. So the idea is to embrace your future. And part of that is positioning yourself as a, for success as a leader in STEM within the broader ecosystem. I call it an ecosystem rather than a sector because there are so many moving parts. And so today's researchers, particularly as an ECR, there's a lot of expectations. And so you really have to be experts, competitive for funding, productive authors, doing work that contributes very broadly, is newsworthy, excellent communicators, drivers of social media, commentators, small business managers, policy advisors and inspiring educators, and much, much more. And we often don't get trained for any of it. So it can be very hard to know, how do I do all this? How do I get this knowledge? And I have advice for you. And these are my top 10 tips that I give to many researchers, and there are others, but generally it's about staying focused, ticking boxes, seeking support, getting connected, building a winning team, even a team of 1. So even if you're working alone, you can be amazing and believe in yourself. Synergize, plan ahead, build resilience, create options, and have an exit plan. Always have a plan B and a plan C, because you never know what curveballs life will throw you. So these are my top 10 tips, and I'm happy to talk to any of them. But in this particular session, because of the topic that we're talking about, you need to connect with the STEM ecosystem. So I want to focus on getting connected and how important that is, because often people get very daunted by the word networking. Why do I need to network? It's so, it's time consuming. I'm not outgoing. I'm not very good at introducing myself. I don't know what to say. I don't know what questions to ask. All very fair questions. particularly if you're on the quieter side. It can be really hard to put yourself out there, but we're going to speak to some of that today so that you understand the value of it and the sheer power of getting connected. So it's about understanding the broader STEM ecosystem and asking questions of everyone you meet. And so we have academia, industry, and government. And it's really important that you understand you're embedded very likely in academia. You may be a laboratory bench worker where you kind of tend to operate very focused on your project. You might be a clinical researcher, you might be out in the field, but I think since this is the neuroscience focus, a lot of people will be in either the clinic or the lab. And so it's really important that you remember as a researcher, when you're so in depth in your detailed project, it's very easy to forget that there's a broader ecosystem out there that's happening around you and that's actually there to support you. And so by reaching out and connecting, you can make many, many friends, many, many, mentors, sponsors, things like that. And you can find people who can become collaborators of the future. They may be aware of potential funding opportunities. So it's about how to navigate these different parts of the sector and the ecosystem and how they work together. So academia has basic science, translational science, preclinical science, we have diagnostic science. And so there's so much diversity within the types of research that we do in academia. And we want those all to connect, even within academia would be brilliant. But then we also need to connect that out to industry, because in order to have impact of knowledge or of practice or of potential drug therapies, you need to be able to innovate. And that means translating that through clinical trials, through commercialization, through marketing, all the way taking it from bench to bedside, right? And so, think about how your Panadol tablets sit on the shelf in your pharmacy and what it took to get them there. And that journey deep, deep down, because it started with an idea and then it moved to a product through all of these different parts. Government's there as well. So obviously they control funding, but also regulations. They make decisions about the sector that really ultimately impact you. We know even with the budget just recently this week, what impact that can potentially have on the entire research sector. And ultimately that impacts the people within each of these parts of the ecosystem. So clearly ECRs are a key part of academia, but then we also have, professionals in industry, potential mentors, and leaders in government. So I encourage you to get to know the people in each of these sectors by getting connected. So connect across these professional sectors by breaking down barriers. Don't think about the dark side and the light side. Let's get rid of that. We're all STEM professionals just trying to work together to help people and make a difference in the world. Respect each other's expertise and what people can bring to the table. We want to respect people as individuals, but let's also respect them as professionals and what they can bring. Get to know people, and that can be, yes, you got to leave your comfort zone here, but it's also about investing in yourself and your future, because by having connections, you never know when someone might be able to help you in the future, but more importantly, when you might be able to help them. And so I encourage you to be generous in this exercise all the time by offering your support whenever you can and your time. So understand how decisions are made. This is a really key one, because a lot of ECRs and PhD students, they don't necessarily, you just don't see it because you're not involved in it. You don't see how these decisions are made. So sometimes something will flow down the pipeline and you get a communication in your inbox and you go, how on earth was this decision made? Who made this decision? So through networking and through connecting, you can ask those questions and you can find out who's who in the zoo, and you can develop a solutions focused mindset. So instead of seeing problems, even though you do see problems, you immediately reframe it and take a positive approach to think about a solution. And so then you can actually take it to the next step, which is the hard part of actually working to put that solution in place. Okay, and so understand the processes by which that occurs. It can be through reviews, consultations, submissions, position statements, advocacy, and policy. And this happens not only at the ecosystem-wide level, you know, within advocacy groups and things like that, like Science and Technology Australia, for example, or where I work at the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, better known as ATSE. These advocacy groups and peak bodies are really important, but this actually also happens within organizations and likely within teams. And so there is an advocacy element where someone comes up with an idea, a proposal to solve the problem, and then that's enacted if there's really good evidence to back it. So learning this now is a very good thing for you. So be the change you want to see and engage. Pardon me, sorry, I knew it would happen. Meet the influencers in the sector. So by getting connected, you can actually meet people who are really, really part of that decision-making process. And that enables you to learn more. I'm going to have to mute for a bit. So sorry, people. And I didn't mute. Please forgive. Social media is another platform where you can have influence. So get to know the organizations on Twitter, but also the people who can have a say, and create your own platform. And that way you can become an influencer within the sector as well. And it can be at all different levels. You can influence locally or nationally, doesn't matter. This also enables you to find mentors, and mentors help you understand these processes really well. It could be a mentor who's an advocate specialist, and that allows you to learn from them how to be more strategic, how to put an argument forward. What do you need to say? Who do you need to talk to? So mentors can really make a difference here. Strengthen your skills and your business acumen so that you can start to understand the drivers of each part of the ecosystem: industry, academia, government. What makes them tick? Why do they want to know things? Why are they asking these questions? Well, you need to understand what their drivers are and how their success is measured. You understand academia, it's publish or perish, and it's all about grants. And we're starting to shift the dial on some of those metrics, but also understand the metrics in the other parts of the sector and develop these types of skills that are on this slide. Get introduced to a vast array of STEM careers by connecting with people. This is the power of connecting. These are your future employers. These are your future colleagues as leaders. These are the people who will rise through the ranks. I encourage you to get connected with the other ECRs online today, with all of the speakers who are here today. Reach out to them either through social media, through email, say, I saw this great talk. I really would love to connect with you and learn more. You know, with the other ECRs there, go for a coffee if you can. Get online, do breakout rooms, connect with people, because that way you have contacts and collaborations going forward. You also get to see that STEM careers are actually incredibly diverse, and that they're much like the London Underground, where you can get on and get off. And we want to see this as the STEM sector. We want to see this for early career researchers within the STEM sector. We want this to be the future of careers in STEM. And therefore, we have to work together to help make that happen. So that's why you're really important. You are the future. So work with peak bodies like ATSE or STA and others. And so an example of some of the advocacy I've done throughout my research career, these are just three in particular I choose. I've been doing this since I was a PhD student, when I was president of the Genetics Society at uni. But it's one of those things that, you know, through the EMCR forum, I was the founding chair. I'm delighted that that group is still going 10 years later, and that it has increasing influence. And I know that you'll hear more about that today, so I won't say too much about it. But it's a really important group for you to engage with. Thousands of ECRs nationally. The Sage Expert Advisory Group, I was on the founding steering committee, and what led to that was being chair of the EMCR forum, because the academies backed Sage as well, and they backed the forum. So it was with the Australian Academy of Science. And that's how you can connect the dots and have other opportunities presented to you. So the founding co-chairs of that reached out to me and said, would you like to be involved? And I'm like, yeah, of course I would. You know, let's get diversity and inclusion happening across the sector. And then, of course, I'm co-founder of Women in STEM Australia. I'm now ambassador of Women in STEM Australia. So this is an organisation I've led for almost 10 years and feel very committed to connecting every single woman across the sector, regardless of who she is, what her background is, where she's come from, and you know, what profession they have, what discipline they're from. We want, if anyone identifies as a woman in STEM, they're welcome. If people identify as advocates or champions or want to be part of it, they're welcome. So it's a very broad church, if you like. It welcomes everybody. And the idea is to really have a voice, but also potential mentors, connections, things like that. So I encourage you to get involved. Madhu Bhaskaran and Sarah Chapman are now the co-chairs of Women in STEM Australia, and I'm pleased to see it thriving. So these are ways that you can drive positive change, influence, and lead. So develop your leadership style, and increase your influence, and be the kind of leader you would follow, and work towards that constantly. Make mistakes, keep learning. It's really important. As an influential leader, you can leverage your platform, whatever that platform looks like, and your capabilities and competencies to actually drive that positive change. I challenge the status quo. I encourage you to do the same and drive systemic and cultural change. It's critical across all of the work that we do, not just as people, but as researchers, as leaders, as influencers. Lead with empathy and really take an inclusive intersectional approach to everything that you do. If you don't understand any of these words, get educated, inform yourself, take the initiative to do that. Keep learning, ask questions, and pay it forward. So where do you start? Well, I have 3 simple steps. It's very, very easy. This is my final slide. Leave your comfort zone and put yourself out there. Step 1. Step 2, say yes, serve, connect, engage. Hint, it can start with your local student society, ECR society, whatever is local to you. That's where these skills begin, right? Being part of this society, get on the exec. That's where these skills begin, and that will drive you to want to do more, trust me, because you'll start to see that change over time. You also are more informed of the change that's happening within the sector. Why is there, you know, a university accord review? Why is there a strategic review of NH and MRC? What's happening, and how can we as a society contribute to that? You can then finally invest in you, because by upskilling yourself and giving yourself a bit of time in your week or in your month to go to that workshop that's there, or to attend, you know, a panel session like this where you are learning something new, that's an investment in you for the rest of your career. That's an investment in your students when you become a group leader, should you do that. Or when you're a business leader in industry, should you do that? Or when you're a policymaker in government, when you do that. So these are skills that will last a lifetime. So I really encourage you to invest now and take those risks and do your homework. Dream big and go for it. Thanks.
I am on mute, I realised. Thank you so much, Dr. Mahi. That was fantastic to hear from you. It was a really great opener to the webinar, and you've shared some fantastic information and advice.
So sorry for the coughing. I apologize.
I'm sure that everyone has forgiven you already. I'm sure that also the audience has probably got a lot of questions so for you, and looking forward to having the Q&A panel discussion at the end. So please type any questions you have into the Q&A section, and we'll get to those or as many as possible when we get to the end. So now to introduce our second speaker, Emeritus David Badcock. David is a recognized leader in behavioral and cognitive neuroscience, specializing in how people see and how visual performance can indicate changes in brain function. He is also president of the Psychology Foundation of Australia, chair of the National Committee of Brain and Mind Sciences, and sits in the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Rolf and Patricia Sarich Neuroscience Research Institute. So thank you, David. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Let me share my slides. Thanks, Maggie. You've covered some really important information there, and you'll see echoes of it in this. This is a very immodest slide, and I apologize for that. What I was going to try to show you is that when you go through a career, you start out interested in science, you do science things, and occasionally you end up in suits talking to people about science policy. And you end up with a list of things that you've done along the way if you're interested in advocacy. Now, some of those things, sorry, I haven't started that properly. Some of those things that I've done are listed there, and I'm not going to go into details of that. Important thing to recognize is that you work in an academic and research world that's constantly changing. And that can be annoying when they change the forms for grant schemes and you have to work out how to fill those in differently. But it also continuously creates new opportunities. And you can either choose to be a passive recipient of those changes, and that's not a really good way to go. But I encourage you not to make that choice, but participate in the conversation that shapes the changes so that you can end up in an environment that works for you and works better for everyone else. First thing, as Maggie said, is you have to be a credible scientist and build networks. You do this normal science things, you maintain an active research program, you collaborate with others to enhance productivity and recognition, and you present regularly at local conferences so that you meet local grant reviewers, employers go to those too, and also people who comment on policy go to those meetings as well, so you should be there. You can volunteer pretty easily to help with conferences. I've got a list there of things that I did over the years, started when I was right at the beginning of my career, as just a co-organizer of a meeting. And then as you move on, you end up chairing meetings and things, but it evolves as you go through and you meet people when you do that. You work with them on the committees as well as talk to them about your science. And so it's an evolving thing. Everybody wants volunteers for conference management. So it's an easy way to get into the process. And I encourage you to take that kind of path. Now, I've worked with a number of different groups over the years. I'm trained in psychology first, and so I was a member of the Australian Psychological Society. I joined its membership committee very early on, and that led to a number of opportunities, just as Maggie was saying. I was able to become secretary of the Division of Scientific Affairs, but also that meant that I got on a selection committee for the Australia Prize, which I hadn't anticipated. I went on to the National Committee on Illumination in the Academy of Science. All of these things were kind of unanticipated consequences when I signed up and became an active member of the society. But the opportunities developed through networking and people knowing that you're about and what you do. Now, there are lots of EMCR opportunities in the Australian Psychological Society through special interest groups, and in most of the committees there are EMCR members. So if you've trained in that discipline, then that's a way to get involved in the national policy discussion. We've had some wins over the year. We've improved accredited training programs, and fortunately in the budget, there was $91 million for additional funding over 5 years for psychology to do a number of different things. Now, that has been an active discussion over more than 10 years, but there was some additional support in this latest budget. So you do get wins along the way if you persist. I've also been chair of the Psychology Foundation of Australia. That's a grouping of research-oriented schools of psychology to try and maintain high standards in teaching, research and training in psychology and its profession within Australia. The membership there is heads of school and invited previous heads of school. We make submissions to government, to the ARC, to the Psychology Board of Australia, and various other groups. There are EMCR opportunities there as well. You should look for them. If you have something in that discipline that bothers you, tell your head of school. They meet so they can feed ideas into the group via the head of school. But more directly, we send every year 2 EMCR researchers from our member schools to attend Science Meets Parliament. That's an event run by Science and Technology Australia, and I'm hoping Mark will talk more about that later in this session, but ask about it if you don't know. An incredibly valuable experience in learning how to lobby and to meet MPs and people from other disciplines who care about the research environment that we all work in. So the EMCR groups within Psychology Foundation, if you're interested, tell your head of school. They make the nominations and we choose people from those people who are nominated, and then we cover all the costs. Ruben might like to describe later what his experience was like a couple of months ago, because he was one of the people we sent this year. I've also been on the National Committee for Brain and Mind in the Academy of Science. That's a body that tries to pull together all of the brain science disciplines within the country to build links between those disciplines, but also to build international links with relevant international bodies. And they write reports on a regular basis. So here's some recent ones on AI regulation within Australia, which is obviously very topical. It's the kind of thing we do. They also made a submission to the National Research Infrastructure Roadmap and University Research Commercialisation Scheme. So those are recent things. Over the years, we've made submissions on career paths for early career scientists. The FOR code revisions might not seem like something that you're very interested in, but a really important way to categorize what we do. Postdoc career paths, so those kinds of things we make submissions on a regular basis. Now, the National Committee explicitly includes EMCR members as part of the committee, and so there are people there. It's done by invitation of the chair and approval of the Academy, but if you're interested, then let the chair who's just taken over, Jason Mattingly, know, and then we'll know that somebody we can consider in the future. So there's an opportunity there you could take up. Now, the National Committee has formed the Australian Brain Alliance. That's 32 organisations that help coordinate Australia's research endeavour and try to obtain additional funding for the brain sciences. And I've been on the executive committee since we started, because it was part of the National Committee for Brain and Mind. But it explicitly includes EMCR representatives on the executive committee. The current co-chairs of the executive committee are Sarah Cohen-Woods and Tony Hannon. And Sarah started with us as an EMCR member. So she's been on for a number of years and is now co-chairing the Australian Brain Alliance. So there's a career path there to be involved in support for Australian brain sciences, and EMCRs have certainly got a role in that. The other thing that we introduced was an early and mid-career researcher brain science network, which is a bit different to the EMCR forum, but I encourage you to also join this. The co-chairs currently are Scott Keel-Chisholm and Heidi Walkden. the representatives from that group are the members of the Australian Brain Alliance Executive Committee. And so by joining that group, you can shape policy for brain sciences in the future in this country. And I encourage you to do that. The EMCR Brain Science Network also hosts various activities you could join in on, like the Jobs Outside the Bubble webinars, which have been very popular over the last few years, where things have been very difficult within universities, talked about career paths that take you into industry and other outlets. And so I would encourage you to investigate that as well. It also has a Twitter page, and that group provides advice to the Australian Brain Alliance Executive about initiatives that we could or should take. So there are opportunities to join in there, and I encourage you to have a go. The National Committee and the Australian Brain Alliance also form the International Brain Initiative. Sorry, I'm going through a lot of different groupings here, but the International Brain Initiative brings together most of the national brain initiatives from around the planet, and it was formed by the Australian Brain Alliance group, been going quite successfully now for many years. The EMCR Executive Committee members of the Australian Brain Alliance are also able to be members of the International Brain Initiative committees. And they've presented a number of things, including a very interesting seminar on early career challenges within brain sciences to the international group in a meeting last year. But they contribute to the other subcommittees as well. Those subcommittees are listed on the left there. There's ones on data standards and sharing, one on neuroethics, one on cross-cultural activity, emotional brain, brain mapping, and so on. So there's another opportunity to get involved. If you join into the Brain Science Network EMCR group, then these things are possibilities if they're of interest, and I encourage you to take some interest in them. Primarily, if you're going to go into this kind of advocacy, it's really good if you're a patient person. Build networks, have discussions with people, be available so that when groups are looking for individuals with particular expertise, they know about you and can be invited, as Maggie was saying had happened to her along the way. Same happened to me along the way. But some of these things take a long time. For example, the FOR codes, as I said, might not be of great interest to you. I first got involved in it when I joined the Psychology Foundation for a revision in 2007. The outcome of that revision was appalling for psychology and for Australian psychology generally. It, for example, included a subcode on Maori psychology, but nothing on Indigenous Australian psychology. So it just missed large chunks of things we thought were very important. So the Psychology Foundation immediately wrote to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, who had organised that round, to show a revised scheme we thought would represent psychology better. We also made submissions to ERA management for the ARC in 2015 and 2018 rounds to say this is really not working for psychology. And then when the revisions came up again in 2018, several of the groups that I've just mentioned were asked to provide input. And we tried to make sure that all of the groups provided a common message about what the revisions needed to be. And we did in the end obtain a sensible outcome. But that was 10 years work. And you had to consistently chip away at it so that you were there and ready when the time came. And you can only do that if you're in the background doing things in these groups so that you're ready. The same thing has been happening with the ERA. Psychology Foundation made several submissions to inquiries that reviewed the processes in the ERA. And our argument all the way through has been that the cost was astronomical. It was equivalent to the amount of money spent on early career ARC grants and fellowships. And we just said it couldn't be justified given the lack of the meaningful consequences of the ERA, and that Australia would be better to spend money on research funding for EMCRs. And we've plugged away at that over the years. Now, the recent review of the ARC goes some way in the direction we've been arguing. in that they're going to discontinue the ERA and the EI and do this in another way, hopefully much cheaper way. So that was another, 10-year process. But some of the things happen quicker. Sometimes they don't. We still argue for improved support for training in psychology. That's another discussion that has gone on for the best part of a decade, but was facilitated or at least reinvigorated by the Better Access package, which was a terrible change to the funding structure. It was claimed to provide additional support for psychology, but in fact reduced funding per place. So there's been a substantial argument with government over that and a positive partial outcome in the budget this week. We also been arguing for a long time for lifting the funding quantum for research. Let me show you about that. The main issue for research is a really general one. And Katrina Jackson's been talking about this in the last few days. Australia has reduced its research funding in real terms, currently spends 0.59% of GDP on research. The OECD average is about 2.68%, which is much, much higher. And if we were able to lift Australia even by 1%, the estimate that Katrina provided is that we would grow the economy by $24 billion over a decade. So there's a good return for this kind of funding. And Australia needs to get back up to the level of the average of the OECD. We would then have much higher grant success rates. We would have more stable early careers within universities. So all of these things would improve if we could get that base level of funding lifted. Next one, probably a bit more controversial in this group. Nearly 2/3 of Australia's research funding goes to medical and health research. And I'm not saying they get too much. What I'm saying is that if we lift funding overall, we could provide a more equal distribution of those fundings across disciplines. One of the clear messages from the ERA is that all areas of Australian STEM perform at equally high levels. The reason that we're really well known for health and medical research is that we fund it at nearly an adequate level. And so if we were able to do that across the board, then the STEM sector would flourish across the board. And we need to be arguing for that. So the underlying message here is don't be a passive consumer of the research environment that you're in. Try to make it better for everybody. How do I go about doing that? Well, join in. EMCR opportunities for this kind of stuff, tell your community so that the community knows we don't have enough funding going into research. MPs listen to the general community. Tell your local MP yourself. If you bump into them at the local farmers market, give them a hard time on the OECD level of funding and how we don't meet it. Pursue opportunities to join in your local societies, whether that be at the university or your profession, and follow up on the opportunities that I've talked about along the way. Now, you can start by joining the Australian Brain Alliance Early to Mid-Career Researchers Network, and they would love to have you, but look for similar things within organisations that are close to your own discipline. Right, I'm going to stop there, and we can talk more about that kind of stuff at the end.
Great. Thank you, David, for sharing your journey and such valuable information. It was really eye-opening to discover wide range of opportunities available for EMCRs. Just a reminder to put any questions you have into the Q&A so we can answer them at the end. Now to introduce our next speaker, we have Dr. Maithili Sashindranath. Dr. Maithili has over 15 years of experience in neuroscience research and is an expert in the fields of brain injury and stroke. She's Deputy Lab Head of the Vascular Biology Group in the Australian Centre for Blood Diseases at the Monash University, where she leads a team of research assistants and PhD students. She is committed to being a role model in the community and visits primary schools to promote interest in STEM and is particularly focused on inspiring young girls to pursue STEM careers. She also has a keen interest in supporting women in STEM and is Deputy Chair of the Monash Centre Clinical Schools Gender Equity and Diversity Committee. Thank you, Maithili.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to present today. So today I am presenting to you as exec member of the Australian Academy of Science Early Mid-Career Research Forum. And that's the EMCR forum that Maggie was a founder of and of course has touched on already briefly. And the Australian Academy of Science, I think, was mentioned by David because he was a member of one of their committees. So as mentioned, I'm an exec member. There's 12 of us, and we have 6,000 members across Australia, and that's obviously EMCRs, and they're from 30 different institutions. And as Maggie mentioned, it was established over 10 years ago. So I just wanted to deep dive into what the EMCR Forum does, just as an introduction to this group of researchers, and hopefully we'll get more involvement from all of you down the track. So the EMCR Forum was set up by EMCRs for EMCRs, and our mission really is to be the voice of Australia's EMCRs. We try to champion improvement in the national research environment, and this is through advocacy and trying to put our voice in amending various science policies out there. So as I mentioned, there's 12 executive members, and we have a membership of a 2 to 3 year period. So every year we recruit maybe 2 or 3, depending on who's rolling off from the committee. And a key selection criteria for us is diversity. And this is something that really stands out for the EMCR Forum because it's by far the only committee that I've ever interacted with where they really push hard to have a very, very, very diverse representation. And you can see here, just with a little Zoom snapshot, we haven't unfortunately all caught up in person for a long time, and that's mainly due to COVID, and now just trying to find mutually suitable times for all of us. And you can see Bella's smiling face there. She's the person who is, I think, part of the Cognitive Neuroscience Society as well as an EMCR Forum exec, and she is the one who asked me to present today. So thanks, Bella. That. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the EMCR Forum is administered by the Australian Academy of Science, and I know a lot of people don't know exactly what the Academy of Science does, so I'll touch on that briefly in a second. But it's really a mechanism for the Academy to engage with EMCR. So unlike the Academy of Science, we're not formally elected and nominated based on our scientific or research outputs and fame and so on. We're more a group of people who are just really, really interested in promoting equity and diversity in STEM, and of course, advocating for EMCRs. So the EMCR Forum advises the Academy on various policies that they recommend to government. And they're also a vital connection between the more eminent scientists that are part of the AAS and the EMCR community, which is us. So the Australian Academy of Science is an institution that's been around for a number of years, and it provides independent authoritative scientific advice. It's a representative body for scientists internationally, and it also tries to build public awareness of science and support excellence in Australian science. And it is a not-for-profit organization where the individuals are elected for their contributions to science and research. No, it's not letting me Google my slides. Can you still see my slides? Yeah. So as I've mentioned, there's 12 executive members, but there are also 29 representatives in what we call the RepNet, or the Representative Network. And these are essentially our representatives across the various universities and in research facilities across the country. So we have 29 representatives from 25 different institutions. And our entire membership is over 6,000 people plus. So anyone can sign up to be a member as long as you recognize yourself as an EMCR. And I'll touch on exactly who we try to include when we use a definition of EMCRs in a second. So most of our membership is early career and mid-career researchers. 88% of them are from universities, And this data is a little bit, it's a couple of years old now, but I think it pretty much stands the same. And quite importantly, we have about 44% of EMCRs who do mention that they have caring responsibilities. So we really do understand a lot of the challenges, including people being on fixed-term contracts and so on. So in terms of membership, we consider EMCRs as those who are actively engaged in STEM research. So either as a researcher or in a role that substantially supports the delivery of research. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about what an EMCR is, and this slide really just sums up a few years of discussions amongst the 12 of us to really come up with a strong definition that is all inclusive. So anyone who's between 0 and 15 years post PhD, and that's discounting career interruptions. And we recognize and include everyone who's in academia, industry, government, public sector, commercial. It really doesn't matter as long as they self-identify as an EMCR. And it doesn't matter if they're in alternative career pathways, because we do understand, as Maggie mentioned, it is an ecosystem, and it is, it's a constant, it's a changing career path for many people. We definitely try and include people from underrepresented intersectional communities who are interested even in embarking on a research career. And we don't necessarily then include you just because you've done a PhD. We do acknowledge that some people don't end up pursuing PhDs, but they have equivalent professional experience. So I think this definition of EMCR, I'm hoping, will get adopted by various similar communities across Australia, and maybe even by the funding bodies and so on, as they start to include more and more people in the definition of an EMCR. So our strategic plan is available on our website, and this is just to show you that we invest a lot of thought into deciding exactly where we are, where we came from, where we're heading, and we amend this every 5 years in accordance with the changing landscape and any new developments that may occur in the Australian research community. So I'm not going into too many details, but please do look it up if you would like to get involved with us further. So obviously we're an advocacy body for EMCRs, and in being that body, we do recognize all the current challenges that EMCRs face. And I can see there's already a question in the Q&A section about some of the challenges that EMCRs are facing. And the main categories, of course, are the lack of job security. Many of us are on 12-month contracts. There's a lack of research funding, and that funding often determines whether we have a job or not the following year. There's a very poor work-life balance that's generally expected of a successful EMCR if you include having high-impact publications and so on as your sole definition of an EMCR. And that's something that we are really trying to modify as well as we progress some of our initiatives. And of course, there's a need to have excellence across multiple benchmarks. And like, again, the question in the Q&A, there's just such high expectations of all of us. And most importantly, there's a lack of support for fundamental research. And that's what some people would call basic science research. That's not necessarily clinically applicable or applicable for industry development down the track. We have, of course, acknowledge that there's still a significant amount of discrimination in the Australian research population, and this disproportionately affects EMCRs because we are typically at the bottom of that pyramid, and so we end up facing a lot of discrimination in terms of gender, disability, cultural background, and of course, caring of responsibilities, working part-time, and so on. So this is actually excerpts from a manuscript that was published in 2021, and it was a survey of early career researchers in Australia. So it's you can see here in this word cloud that all of us at the end of the day really love what we do. We love our research. We love working in academia. We really want to continue all of this, and we really enjoy it. But then you can start to see that in the periphery of this word cloud, there are a significant number of issues that are sort of challenging our interest and capacity to continue in a research career. And that includes things like grants, things, in the research environment, the competitiveness, and so on. And you can see in this in these graphs on the side, like probably the saddest part of the graph on top is that the dark blue bar is the authors asking researchers, do you intend to leave research? So it's not even, are you happy or unhappy? It's actually, are you that unhappy to a point where you would want to leave this career. And you can see there are a number of people who actually say they're done with this career and they're ready to leave. And that's because the job doesn't meet their expectations. It's really difficult and so on. And of course, this is linked to now the graph below, which shows you why people want to leave, because there's a lack of funding, there's lack of job security, and a similar kind of issues that I touched on in the previous slide. So there are obviously objective studies out there that really put some of the feelings that the EMCRs have currently into tangible, quantifiable data. So our role really is to share the views, perspectives, and feedback of the EMCR community. We try to promote an open conversation. We want to try and listen to people. We really encourage people to engage with us and tell us what they would like us to focus on or what they would like us to advocate for. And as I've already mentioned, diversity and inclusion is really, really important for us. We also try and improve career accessibility. We focus quite significantly on developing or advising people on career sustainability, so that you don't see this the end of the road every time you hit the end of a grant cycle. And as I mentioned, we're working quite hard to redefine research success. So it's not just high impact papers. There are so many other ways in which you can measure your research success to actually feel that you're making a contribution. So our core tasks, and this is what the 12 of us do on a regular basis. So we meet once a month, but these are our main focuses essentially. So we have quite a strong media and communications engagement with funding bodies. So we constantly get contacted by the ARC and the NHMRC for input on any changing schemes and so on. And as you can imagine, there's some of us that are more NHMRC inclined and some of us that are more ARC inclined. And so we divvy up the roles accordingly and provide feedback to these funding bodies. We also regularly have policy and government submissions and position statements, and I'll show you some examples in the upcoming slides. As I mentioned, we have the wide representative network. We also run the Theo Murphy initiative, which promotes various activities for EMCRs, and it's an amount of funding that you can apply for any kind of EMCR related activity that you would be interested in promoting. As I mentioned, strong focus on equity, diversity, inclusion, and intersectionality. We also try and promote engagement with the non-academic research sector. For example, quite a few of our members are from CSIRO. And we work on we also have these smaller one-year projects where last year we worked quite hard on redefining success, as I've already touched on. And every second year we organize the Science Pathways Conference. So that is, again, an entire conference dedicated to just on focusing on EMCR related issues, where we have invited speakers. We get universities to sponsor attendance from EMCRs like you so that you can join in and you can participate. So we are having one in 2023. So do look out for the advertisements for that. So like I mentioned, we've been trying to work on how we redefine success. So we are trying to move away from research metrics like the number of citations and publications, impact factors and patents, which are especially relevant for someone in the earlier stages of their career. And we're trying to encourage a lot of the funding bodies to think bigger about how they would measure if a particular person is worth investing on in the future. And we're trying to do this by increasing the ways in which impact can be measured. And it's not just for specific STEM sectors, because impact can be different in different sectors. We're trying to empower the EMCRs to raise their own profile so that they can then strongly articulate the value of their work. And we're also trying to increase the visibility of diverse STEM career paths. So rather than, you just continue from your level A up to your level E in academia, and if you don't end up with that particular trajectory, you're considered a failure. We're trying to encourage people to view them as career stepping stones. So you move from one thing to the next and you keep developing your career. It doesn't necessarily have to just be in one single academic institution. So as I mentioned, we do we make regular submissions and position statements, and this is just an excerpt from our website on the submissions we've had in 2023 alone. And so all of us generally collaborate on this, and whoever has particular interest will lead it. So we recently submitted a position paper on Australia's science and research priorities, and this was commissioned by the Department of Industry, Science and Resources. So they came to us saying we're looking for an EMCR perspective, and then we submitted a paper on that. We also had an article in the Sydney Morning Herald where we were interviewed for, and we were talking about the STEM workforce and how COVID has impacted it significantly. And there was another recent article that was then picked up from Nature Careers about how early career researchers in Australia are miserable at work. So we really try and put the voice of EMCRs out there as often as we can. This is something that we made at the end of last year, which was the independent review of the ARC Act. So, none of us really come with any kind of policy or legal training or anything like that, but we learn as we go. We put our heads together, we come up with what really, really impacts us, and we then get the help of the Academy to prepare these submissions, because they've obviously got communications and people who are highly skilled in this area. So yeah, that's the Science Pathways brochure from 2021. So I encourage you to look out for Science Pathways 2023, sign up and get involved, and do reach out to us if you have any suggestions for how we can make Science Pathways more engaging and encouraging for EMCRs. And with that, I'd just like to tell you that you can find our membership form online so that you can join our community. We're also very active on Twitter, and with our handle being at EMCR Forum, and that's just my Twitter handle there. And I also just wanted to touch on the fact that through my role in the EMCR exec, I was invited to be part of the NHMRC Women in Health Sciences Committee for 2022 to 2024. So getting involved in something like the EMCR Forum exec really leads to great opportunities like both Maggie and David have already touched on. And with that, I might stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take questions later on.
Great. Thanks, Michael, for the rundown of the EMCR Forum. Please put any questions you have into the Q&A so we can discuss them at the end of the session. Now to introduce our last speaker, Professor Mark Hutchinson. Mark is an ARC Future Fellow and Professor within the Adelaide Medical School, the Director of the ARC Centre for Excellence for Nanoscale Biophotonics. Mark is also President of Science and Technology Australia, the peak body in Australia that represents 110,000 scientists. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak, and so awesome to follow such esteemed colleagues. Today, I'm going to touch on what it practically means to connect government policy to research and to tangibly, hopefully, give you some ideas of who, how and why you can actually make those connections. I'm joining you today from Ghanaland. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and understand a lot more as I journey through life about the multidimensional way that Indigenous people connect to country. It's not just about the turf on the ground, it's about the air, land, water, and the critical dimension of time. The longest persisting community in the world is here amongst us, and that's something to be really celebrated together. So I want to start with some questions, and if you can, open up notes on your computer and quickly jot down your first responses, or if you've got a pen and paper handy, again, just jot them down. Quickly answer, who and how would you engage if you wanted to change any of these 6 things in the research ecosystem? Delays to funding announcements and delays to grants approvals. Who would it be that you'd reach out to and say, hey, this needs to change? Inadequate support for interdisciplinary cognitive neuroscience research projects. I wonder who cares about that? That could be you. Who would you connect to? Lack of transparency in poor grant reviews. Who would you connect to? And how would you go about it? And then if you're broadening it out to let's change the world, let's change the whole healthcare ecosystem, how do we change how hospitals are resourced? How do we actually get drugs available or medicines available, and perhaps even greater accessibility, as David pointed to greater opportunities for psychological care? So just quickly, if you can, make some jots down, and then at the end, I'm going to re-ask you those same questions, and hopefully what I've told you might actually tell you about where you were hitting the spot, and yeah, you, but then where actually those touch points where you thought you could make a change, actually we need to learn a little bit more and look under the hood some further at the mechanisms at play. But first, to the question in the Q&A, how does someone do this in amongst everything else? And I want to completely smash down any expectations. I am not brilliant. I am not special. I am an ordinary person going about living a family life. Here's me and my family. My partner, Amanda, she's an associate professor in clinical psychology at UniSA. Hello, team at UniSA. With our 2 kids that we are doing an N of 2 experiments trying to work out how we do this. This is how social media looks. This is how it really is. Stuff happens and it's messy. It is not always nice. And clearly, for an ECR, MCR, as you look to plan out your career, it is not a linear path. There are roundabouts, there are swings, there are roller coasters, there are dead ends. That is okay. But you need to sort of jump on for the ride and make that ride as sustainable as possible. It is not there is no finish line in this career. You've got to build the story you want. As Maggie and others have said, jump on and have a crack at it. To give you an idea of why I know I am not the smartest person in the room every time, these are the lists of things that I do, my version of David's. These are the lists of tasks and skill sets that I have to perform, and I have a degree in 3 of those. That is it. I'm eternally learning new skills and capabilities to take me forward to these new locations. This is something you can do as well. If you jump in, start with the next thing that you want to learn, and it doesn't have to be a course. It can be a podcast, it can be a book you read, it can be something that you get your toe in the water to actually step forward on. But what that has culminated, and an absolute honour to be the President of Science and Technology Australia. When I left PhD land and did a postdoc, I didn't think I'd be here. When I came back from the US and started up my own lab, I did not think I was going to be here. And even today, I don't think I'm going to be here, having done the ARC legislative review. Thank goodness, 3 weeks ago it was all done. That's 6 months of my life that I won't get back again. But amazing privilege to take this role, to step forward and put the model of service for others at the forefront. The key part about what STA does, and thank you for those who have hacked it before to us, STA is the peak body that represents you. You as the scientists and technologists and researchers out there in the community at every stage of the career. There's 115,000 of you that are members of members. So if you're a member of APA, if you're a member of Australian Neuroscience Society, if you're a member of, insert here, Research Society, you're probably a member of STA as well. STA sits in Canberra with an amazing, talented, really, really lean, small team of people who work in policy, who connect with business leaders, who are daily on the Hill talking to officers of ministers, to departments about what the opportunities are and the risks about what's happening, to allow for policy change for the better, which hopefully comes with dollars, but sometimes it's just removal of hurdles that are unfortunately in the way. You may know of STA because of some of the peak activities we run. For example, Science Meets Parliament. Thank you, David. Yes, get in and go to SMP. And know that whilst SMP, there are 2 slots per member to go and attend, anybody can sign up and be supported to attend the online versions of SMP now. So you can still get this knowledge distilled down in a form that you can then actually use. Superstars of STEM. STEM communicators, STEM ambassadors, the Science Policy Fellows alumni, the new National Industry PhD program, a load of different opportunities to engage, to train, and as we've heard, get that experience so you can practice it before you actually need to use it. So that's where we've come from. What I want to do now is unpack for you what the day in the life of, I've got an idea, I want to make a difference. How do I go about making a difference? And for this, I've really focused on that health and medical, psychological targeted opportunity. So who, how and why do we make this change between government policy and research? So let's start with our year, probably 4 or 5 civics. What does the Australian government do? Or what does government broadly do at a federal level? It does a lot of things. And there are lots of different levers and pulleys and inputs that you can have a say in this system. And as we've seen, policy submissions, consultations, forums where ideas are shared, these are all available to you, but they're very defined mechanisms to get in and have a say. If we know about how legislation happens, that is very different to how policy happens. And so an elected official and a lot of other people are involved in influencing how legislation happens. And let me reflect to you, the ARC legislative review for the ARC Act does not have anything about grants guidelines in it. It doesn't have anything to do with how much money the ARC gets. It's all about what is the ARC for? Why does it exist? So there are pieces of the legislative framework which are very, very different to how things actually get done at an operational level. So if we think about health system broadly, there are multiple levers to this. And so if we keep yelling to Canberra about some things that we want changed, they may be in Canberra not the ones who have the control over what actually you want changed. So have a look, and the easiest thing is to follow the money. Who pays for what the service is that you want changed or the research dollar that you want influenced? Get to know the system. Health is massive. It is super complicated. So to give you an idea, here is the organisational framework of the Australian Department of Health and Aged Care. These officers all oversee various different elements of the machinery that exists for the Department of Health and Aged Care. Now, when you have previously thought about the Department of Health and Aged Care, you often will think about the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Now, remember, the Minister for Health and Aged Care is Mark Butler, but there are also assistant ministers who sit alongside and work with Mark and the team to engage in various elements of this. So as you're starting to work out who, in an elected official sense, you should meet with, there are probably 2, 3, maybe 4 individuals at a federal level that you need to tell the same message to. And that doesn't even touch the state health departments. Let me just zoom back out for a moment and say, where does NHMRC sit in the organisational chart of the Department of Health and Aged Care? It doesn't sit inside the organisational chart of the Department of Health and Aged Care. It is a portfolio agency. It's over here on the left-hand side. That doesn't mean that it's not part and informed by this, because there are 2 people who oversee very important portfolios. Philip Gould, he runs the program of work that understands and sets the priorities when those specific NHMRC special calls for X, they're the ones who run economic analysis and background research capabilities analysis to say, should we make this call for special initiatives? Then Masha and her team, they run the MRFF and set the priorities and the schemes within that system that happens to then be administered by the NHMRC. So there is no point complaining to the NHMRC about the MRFF funding, because NHMRC only administer it through the Sapphire system. If you want to influence the MRFF, you have to talk to AMRAB and to the minister about how that works, and or talk to Masha and her team. If you want to influence NHMRC calls, then perhaps you need to talk to Phil and others within the department broadly across a wide variety of disciplines. I somewhat giggle inside when people say, oh, but I've talked to the Department of Health. Have you really? Look at this slide. This is all of the people in the Department of Health. Do they all know your story? No, some of them may not need to. Have a think about who you're talking to and why. Then there is the classic question of, where do I get my money from to be able to do the research that I want to do? The Australian system is somewhat convoluted and strange because the ARC, the Australian Research Council, sits under the Department of Education and Training. The NHMRC sits under the Department of Health, which is separate from the Medical Research Future Fund. Now, you would expect that if an idea from an NHMRC grant leads to a translational outcome in the MRFF, the two should be connected, right, and somehow systemized together. No, of course it doesn't work that way yet, but things are heading this way. This is what we need to be advocating for. So again, think about where the conversations need to be to target the change you're looking for. So how do we then connect with policy and government? As Maggie pointed out, advocacy on social media is spectacular for identifying the changes that may need to warrant changes in policy. But there is no point at all arguing policy change on social media because there are defined mechanisms and consultations that can then flow through to policy change. I can say this, having sat on the ARC Legislative Review, we received 223 submissions. The 222nd submission based on my list here was from the Australian Academy of Science Early and Mid-Career Researchers Forum. Thank you. 222. The ARC tracker has nearly 13,000 followers. All of the people who've complained about our ARC review to me, I then look and say, did you put in a consultation submission response? No, they didn't enter into the process via which you can actually influence policy. Do not expect that your university, your institution, your centre will speak the words that you want heard. You can make your own submissions into this system, but don't necessarily just yell it out to the social medias, put it via these systems. So what does it look like in and around life happening and actually influencing how this process happens? A submission in schematic, simple diagrams here. You have to think about what you want to submit. Sometimes you need to didactically yell it out from a soapbox, but you need to write it down. You need to probably practice train it. It's a balancing act of asking for the right thing in an evolved fashion. There's some timing in your request, so you have to get things on time, one, but sometimes it's also about who you're talking to. There's a bit of luck. You have to have practiced the use of the words previously. You sometimes may need to travel. You sometimes may need to take the first step forward and take the leadership role and have that uncomfortable position of being the person at the front. But critically, don't just do all the talking. Actually listen to others and hear reflected back how that pitch was received so that then you can have group conversations, you can write your submissions and get it out there. Now, just a simple diagram to show you why sometimes we have failed historically. I was fortunate enough to get access to the 16,000 successful ARC grants over the 23 years that the ARC has existed. It's all publicly available. You can get this too if you want to. And these are the publicly accessible abstracts. I did some simplified text analysis on this, these publicly accessible, publicly available abstracts. This is the simple version that's publicly out there, and ran the SMOG score on it. So SMOG is the simple measure of gobbledygook. How much complex terminology is included in the abstract. Score of 17 is roughly requiring a PhD level of training to understand what is in the publicly accessible version of a discovery project grant. You will notice here, 2011, 12, and 13, and then again 2017, there's sudden drops in the readability, hence more readable portions of these abstracts. These were the 4 years when the ARC took it upon themselves to make the abstracts more readable. We have not responded as a community to the readability of our own publicly accessible grants. We have to work better at communicating clearly as to why the work we are doing is actually making a difference. And you could, all of these lines are individual FRI codes. There's no particular one discipline that does it better unless someone else comes in and does it for us to clean up at the way we use our terminology. So what's the future? If you want to see my vision for how we can change this whole landscape, Go and look at my National Press Club from last year, where I talk about taking a bench to boardroom model, taking this idea of fundamental discoveries in the lab and moving them through to life and allowing us to actually have translational impact and intentionally structuring that. It's not an easy journey. I'll tell you now, it's a long and patient one, as David pointed out, but it is one that is worthwhile because we can then actually make a difference. So let me go back quickly to, in the last couple of seconds, to those early questions. If you want to influence things like delays in announcements and funding and approvals, you have to talk to your minister. You can also talk to your local member to try and get a change. You can talk to the department, but you can also talk to the agency. You can't just yell at the agency. They aren't the ones necessarily who are the ones that can make the change. The one that I find fascinating is we often complain to the agency, NHMRC and ARC, about how terrible the reviews were on our grants. They didn't do the reviews. We did the reviews. Our peers did the reviews. We got to talk to our peers about actually doing a good job and being nice to people, about actually providing quality feedback. Now, yes, sometimes the agencies don't do those review responses in time. Sometimes they hide the comments and there's some other things that can be done to improve that. But we're shifting the dial on that. So have a think about the breadth of the type of people we need to change the system. With that, I'm going to leave it there and hopefully we can have a bit of a chat together.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, everybody. Thank you to all our 4 speakers. I think that we can all agree that it has been a fantastic webinar, and no doubt, you know, our audience have gotten so much information, advice and inspiration from the wonderful things that you've shared. So thank you, all the 4 speakers, for coming along today. Maggie, thank you for coming along, even though you're feeling a little bit unwell, but you did a fabulous job. So, you know, a huge virtual appreciation and a round of applause from us and the audience. I actually don't know if I can't even do a reaction. I don't know. I can't multitask that way. So we've got time for some Q&As. We've got some questions that have come through on the chat, so it might be worthwhile starting with those in the rest of the time that we have left. I'll start maybe perhaps with this one, as there seems to be, you know, a bit of a theme. So I think from the presenters, what we got was this sort of wonderful shared theme about this strong message about how that it's really important that we shouldn't be these passive consumers of the environment, but, you know, to make it better for everyone to be all inclusive and involving in terms of being proactive in this landscape. And this is great to hear. It's the core of the message that we wanted to get out from holding this webinar. And here's one of the questions that sort of, or the theme that's come up in some of the questions is, you know, so how do you manage being these sort of active consumers and kind of an ECR while managing sort of time and all of the other life responsibilities that many of us have, and sort of being proactive in this space and navigating this landscape while also not spreading yourself too thin? So it's that balance. Any thoughts, advice around that? Oh, David, you put your hand up a little bit there.
Yeah, look, I tried to, at the beginning, make clear that if you look at a senior academic's career and the things that they've done, it looks like they might have done a lot of things. But of course, it didn't look like that at the start. And so the main thing is that you keep busy. For me, like obviously for Mark, my family always came first. And I tried to be really busy on the other things that were available to me. And, you know, sometimes that was my research lab and grants that I needed to get written. Sometimes it was an opportunity within one of the organizations that I had volunteered to do things for. But you don't do everything all at the same time. It just, after a while, you accumulate a list of things of different types. So the main thing is to just be a busy, engaged person, and these things will accumulate. But nobody can do huge amounts of all of these things at the same time.
That's some great.
I can probably add to that if that's okay.
Thank you, Maggie.
It is a real challenge. So I completely empathize with the question. And it's actually a very common question after this type of talk. So the practical things that I would say are start small. So do what you can do. And that can be as simple as connecting with people in the seminar, the departmental seminar that you're going to. And a lot of people won't do that. They'll sort of sit there with their friends and they'll look around the room. Oh, I wonder who they are. I wonder what lab they're in. And so I encourage you to sit up the front, right? Don't just let all the professors sit up the front. You go sit up the front in the very front row and start introducing yourself. It's really hard. I want to address one of the questions that talks about shy and introverted people. 100% I'm an introvert. A lot of people do not believe me when I say that because I'm so outgoing and I engage and da da da. I'm actually an extremely quiet person. For the first year at university, I came from North Queensland, a regional area, to Brisbane, which to me was the big smoke. And I did not speak for a year, except to the people I knew really, really well from Mackay who had come. But I'd sit and watch. And so what I did was I'd sit in the common room because I wanted to be around people. I just didn't necessarily want to talk to them, right? But I'd watch. And so I got to learn how people interact. I grew up with a single parent. I didn't have any siblings at home because my brother died young. And so it was just me and mum. And that was a really strange environment for me to be in. I'd never heard of networking. I'd never been to a museum. There were a lot of things that were very new to me. But when you watch and learn, and then you just take courage, you have courage, and you just try one day, as simple as talking to an ECR, you don't know, you practice. And that's how simple it becomes. Over time, you will gain confidence. You will screw up, you will make mistakes, and that's okay. You have to forgive yourself. Then if you can identify someone who'll give you some advice, a PhD supervisor, or if they're not very good at networking, go talk to someone who is, someone who can just give you a bit of tips and tricks. And before you know it, you'll start to travel that journey too. I learned, I made mistakes. I put myself out there to people I didn't even know. But now when I network, I'm very strategic. I think about what events I want to go to and why. I think about who I'm going to meet there. I try and understand who will be in the room and is there anyone in particular I need to meet for whatever reason. Something as simple as I went to Science Meets Parliament. I didn't really have an agenda. I just wanted to go. I wanted to engage. But being there, I saw who was in the room and I thought, oh, fantastic. I haven't seen the CEO of MTP Connect for a long time. I'm going to go talk to Stuart. Now, I already knew Stuart, but we shared information and where are you at? Where are we at? How can we help each other? And so now we can help MTP Connect and they can help us better because we had that conversation. It was quite spontaneous, but also very meaningful. So I encourage you to put yourself out there, invest your time where you can. As a parent, I know how hard that is. I know that I've had privilege because I've had a partner who has supported me on that and he's equal share on the parenting aspects. Not everybody's in that situation, but you do what you can. And that's actually why social media was supportive to me in that way, because it was something I could do easily at home on the couch while I was watching TV, you know, and taking a break. So it's simple things like that. Just do what you can, but I encourage you to grow over time as you get that support around you.
Great, thank you so much. That's just been so helpful, and that was going to be the next question as well, because it's always let's be proactive, and more often than not, a question will arise. But we're introverts, and it's amazing how many people in academia are introverts, yet still manage to be very engaging, or at least everyone else thinks everyone else is very engaging.
And you have to take time to energize. You have to go be by yourself, right, for a while afterwards, and that's okay.
I will open up to Mate Healy or Mark if you wanted to add to anything to that sort of broader question.
Yeah, these are the really interesting points that have been raised, and certainly a lot of advice from Maggie and David. And I sort of wanted to echo a similar kind of advice in that you don't spread yourself too thin. You generally move from one thing to another. And this I touched upon this when I was speaking as well. I'm very motivated on this idea of stepping stones. So one thing leads you to another, and it's the same thing in your career. It's the same thing with networking, and it's the same thing with activities. So, for example, I was always really passionate about, obviously, gender equity and diversity in science. And so when they commissioned the JEDI committee, as we call it in our school, I said, yep, I want to be the representative. And that's just me representing my department of 10 postdocs or something like that. But when I started that, then they were looking for obviously a bit of leadership. And I said, yep, I'm happy to be deputy chair. And then I did that role for a couple of years. And that sort of set me up to then have a little bit of background to then say, I want to join the ECR forum and I want to take it forward. But through this, every time you sit in a committee with anyone, you build a really, really strong network just by being in that committee. And for me, that's really what I look for. So every couple of years, I look for something else that's going to extend my network through being involved in committees like this, because you build very strong bonds. You're often, you end up as very close friends with everybody you work in these committees. So you don't think of yourself as spreading yourself too thin. You think of yourself as moving from one role to another. And every time you move, you expand your network because one person knows 10 other people. And then if you ever need anything, so with the ECR forum, there are people from all aspects of STEM. So now I know people in the industry, I know people everywhere. So if I needed something from someone in industry, I could reach out to these people saying, hey, do you know so-and-so? I can see on LinkedIn, you are connected with so-and-so. And for me, that's a more that's been a very effective way of networking rather than going to drinks and so on, which again is not possible when you have young kids like I do as well. So you do what you can, but yeah, being on committees and moving from one to another has worked really well for me, I found.
The only thing I would say is, Richard concurs everything here. I term it as dual purposing. So I'm at a meeting, like Maggie said, SMP. The other person I want to see, they happen to be in the same location. Boom, let's connect. I'm driving to work. I've got to drop the kids off to sports practice. I'll put a podcast on whilst I'm waiting for them to finish. And that podcast is about something that I want to learn more about. It's only 5 minutes, but suddenly I've got this new idea that I want to go and do some more of my own research on. And I'm opened myself up to something new. Dribs and drabs, bits and pieces here and there. It's amazing when you put those profound, I always think about Hugh Kearns from Think Well when he talks about fitting life in. If you start with the sand and then you put the little bigger rocks and the bigger rocks on top, it'll never happen. Start with those mega things that are super important and then start scattering the other things in. You get an awful lot more in. It can be exhausting, so you need self-care. Be really good and self-reflective on that, but you can get so much, you can contribute in bits and pieces to actually shift the dial.
That's great. Thank you all to all of our 4 speakers. That was a fantastic response to that question, and no doubt that's something that most of our audience is something we're grappling with. I think we're almost time to finish up. Julia, did you want to, as our co-chair, finish up for the day? So big thank you from me personally, and I'm sure the team as well.
Thank you so much for our speakers today. It was really inspiring and eye-opening. And thanks to everyone for attending our first webinar of 2023. And we'll hopefully schedule another webinar throughout the year. Thank you so much for your time today.